In my last video, I discussed Bernardo Kastrup's Analytic Idealism and how reality is mental at its core. Reality functions more like a mind instead of a machine. Reality is not independent of observation or mind in light of the observer effect in quantum mechanics. I urge you to go back and watch my previous video to get up to speed on what I'm discussing in today's episode. That video is hyperlinked in the description below. I argued that universal consciousness is personal and that it resembles the God of the Bible, not a random and impersonal force. And I based that on the vivid details of religious narratives and experiences that are personal through the ups and downs of life. This constitutes the constant effort we make to connect with the divine and to keep God at the center of our daily lives through prayer, worship, rituals, and the reading of sacred texts. Furthermore, for me, the impersonal, purposeless aspect of universal consciousness disappears when combining Tanya Luhrmann's Anthropology on struggling Christians with Kastrup's claim that universal consciousness can impinge upon our dissociative boundaries. It leaks into the awareness of humans that are dissociated alters from the mind at large, like multiple personalities within a person who has dissociative identity disorder, or DID. I realize that might be a crude psychiatric analogy associated with the suffering of mental illness and contrary to the traditional Christian understanding that the God of the Bible is intending to help and not harm us. But for others, it might paint a clear picture of why we perceive ourselves as completely separate from the rest of nature and how we all might appear in this gigantic landscape of a mental reality. I'm seeking to make do with these limitations of language. So, welcome to the Common Caveat Show. I am your host, Matthew Sabatine, helping you navigate the crossroads of the Christian faith, science, and the human experience. Without further ado, let's get into it. In my last video, I did not dive into the scientific experimental evidence for Bernardo Kastrup's Analytic Idealism, but I'm going to do that in this video. And I'm drawing from pages 93 through 98 of his book called The Idea of the World. This comes from chapter 6, which he says is the core of his book. Here, Kastrup cites multiple empirical sources to defend the hypothesis that we live in a mental universe. Two sources in particular stand out to me, mainly because they're not restricted behind a paywall. Those sources are hyperlinked for you in the video description below. His hypothesis seems to rest on the observer effect. Observing a particle can change its state or behavior. Measuring it can alter whether it behaves like a wave or a particle. Human eyes and minds can influence matter. Therefore, he infers that the world has no existential independence from observation and is not essentially nor categorically separate from mentation. But what is influencing matter when humans are not present? Well, I think that is the elephant in the room, ladies and gentlemen. And if I were Kastrup, I'd say the answer is universal consciousness or mind at large. I, as a Christian, call that an omnipresent mind or a creator. Back in the day of Northern Irish physicist John Bell, people widely believed in the concept of locality, which means objects that are separated by any distance at all cannot instantly influence each other because nothing travels faster than light. They also believed in realism, which means that physical properties such as an electron's spin are present before we measure them. But he developed the theorem that says if locality and realism are true, there must be limits as to how distant particles can correlate with each other. However, quantum mechanics predicts stronger correlations, which means that locality or realism or both must be wrong. Here's an analogy for you. Pretend you have two dice. They always match when rolled, even when miles apart. Bell undermined classical theory's explanation of this, which assumes that dice have preset numbers and no secret communication. Quantum mechanics shows the non-realism of the dice, which is to say that the dice have no fixed numbers before rolling. The non-realism is found in the fact that they can instantly affect each other or talk, metaphorically and poetically speaking. The first piece of empirical evidence I want to mention is a 2015 report about a loophole-free test on entangled electron spins that instantly affected each other in spite of being separated by 1.3 kilometers, which is around 51,000 inches or 4,000 feet. They ensured the particles were properly linked before measuring them and ensured that the entangled state had minimal errors or noise. They ruled out biases in favor of local realism by getting an approximate 99% detection efficiency for electron spins in diamond nitrogen vacancy centers. Those NV centers are tiny imperfections inside diamond crystals that are useful in advanced technologies. There was no need to discard data nor suspect that undetected events were mimicking detected ones. The 1.3 kilometers of spatial separation between the two entangled spins was intended so that if light or any signal tried to pass through them, it would take approximately 4.3 microseconds. But the researchers completed their measurements in approximately 3.7 microseconds, thus making it impossible for the signals to travel between the detectors. They had the quantum random number generators operating at 100 million times per second to ensure that decisions were made too quickly for hidden variables of hypothetical, unmeasured parameters to influence anything in advance. The experimenters did 245 trials in 2015. They used a mathematical rule called the CH-SH inequality, which stands for Closser, Horn, Shimony, Holt, the names of the physicists who made the inequality in 1969. And the S value is a correlation parameter that can't exceed the number 2 if local realism is absolutely true. But quantum mechanics allows the S value up to the square root of 2, seen here. Quantum mechanics predicts that entangled particles can violate this inequality and give us 2.828. Their exact result was this. S equals 2.42 plus or minus 0.20. The 2.42 exceeds the classical limit of 2 that violates the inequality, and the plus or minus 0.20 represents the statistical uncertainty or standard deviation. They found a statistical significance in the null hypothesis test. 3.9% measured the level of chance that local realism could produce the S correlation parameter being less than or equal to 2.42. Local realism is rejected here because it's below the 5% threshold for statistical significance, meaning we have 95% confidence that local realism is not the whole story. We are 95% confident that entangled particles can instantly affect each other across distances. Continuing on in chapter 6 of Kastrup's book, he uses contextuality to undermine realism's claims that objective reality exists independently of human thought, since multiple failed attempts have been made to show that physical properties had a presence in non-contextual circumstances previous to observation. A core problem for realism is that definitions for the quantum state are based on biases about macroscopic observations. Macroscopic is a word opposite of microscopic and deals with large-scale objects. The second piece of empirical evidence mentioned by Kastrup is the work of Italian theoretical physicist Carlo Rovelli, known as a co-founder of loop quantum gravity. Rovelli's relational interpretation swallows the hard pill of quantum theory's strange results instead of modifying it to his personal tastes. Rovelli's 2008 paper titled Relational Quantum Mechanics tries to quell the concerns that physicists have felt toward the measurement problem and the observer's relation to what is being physically measured. In relativity, two events that are simultaneous for one observer may not be simultaneous for another, showing that time is not absolute but relative to the observer's frame of reference. Similarly, in quantum mechanics, properties like position and momentum do not exist in an observer-independent way. Instead, they are defined only in relation to a particular observer or interaction. Just as absolute time fails in relativity, the notion of absolute observer-independent properties fails in quantum mechanics. Here, the C approaches infinity limit, seen above, and the H-bar approaches zero limit, and these are two concepts that both break down when moving beyond their approximate conditions or domains. Rovelli uses equations to illustrate his point that quantum states and measurement outcomes depend on the observer. He mentions that we have two observers, observer O and observer P. For the observer O's description, we have S as the measured system. Its process involves this initial state of S. The A and B looking symbols are complex numbers. The result that comes after the measurement is a collapse into an eigenstate of a definite predictable value for a specific observable, the one that you see here inside these symbols. This forces us to conclude that our definite outcome is a value of 1 in the quantum operator representing the measured physical quantity. Next, we have observer P's description with a system plus measuring apparatus, and the initial state of the process is seen here, the initial state for P. The result after measurement is an entangled superposition, seen here, and that lands us on the conclusion that system S and observer O are in a linear combination of multiple states called superposition, with P having no collapse or abrupt transition into a single definite state. S, let me grab my physical observer here again. S is in this state relative to the observer O, but in a superposition relative to the P observer. Neither description is more real. Both are valid within their relational contexts. The collapse is a relational fact and not an objective event between the system and the observer O. Entanglement persists with no collapse for the P observer who doesn't interact with the system S nor the observer O. So although Rovelli is ontologically neutral or unspoken on the topic of consciousness as fundamental, Kastrup leverages quantum contextuality of properties depending on observation to say that reality consists of mental correlations within a universal consciousness. When Kastrup says that quote, the world is relational, he means that, quote, an observation does not create a world shared by everyone, but just the world of that particular observer, end quote, which could explain our different experiences while occupying the same space. For instance, when occupying the same car of the same make, model, and year, you might smell cigarette smoke while I do not. I may pay more attention to the leather seats or spidered cracks on the windshield while you may not. You may think the car is messy while I find it comfortable and cozy. On and on the differences can go. If mental states are the underbelly to everything that is physical, if our feelings are real, if they are worthy of attention and can be correct about anything at all, I think we can build a case that says our feelings are correct, that says, hey, life and reality is personal. I suppose my intellectual defense for feelings is analogous to heuristic versus analytic reasoning. Heuristic thinking involves the mental shortcuts for quick and efficient decision making, similar to the snap decisions you need to make when evading incoming catastrophic objects. Meanwhile, analytic reasoning involves slow and deliberate processes that try to checkmark all the boxes, similar to writing a research paper, logically speaking. Maybe the professional philosophers, psychologists, and physicists would disagree with my intellectual defense of feelings or thinking from the gut, but gut-based intuitions can be correct at times, even though our feelings can be distorted by paranoia and inner chaotic noise. For instance, fleeing from the rustling bushes because you suspect a predator might be there when it's actually just the wind is an intuition that might be inaccurate, but doesn't really deserve scornful criticism when you're trying to be as safe as possible. Another instance is an infant's intuition that a solid object will have some recoil when bumping into another solid object. That intuition is rooted in reality, even though the protocol is not to use intuitions when testing things in the lab. So if it's not far-fetched to say my intuitions are correct, that there is meaning in my joys, sorrows, regrets, and other emotional experiences, why should I disregard the premise that life and reality are personal, especially in light of the personal, vivid details of religious narratives, faith frames, and paracosms? Life and reality certainly feel personal when we consider how modern Christians lament the challenges of remaining faithful to God, how Christians remind us to give God the respect he deserves and to adjust ourselves to have him bless us. In her book, How God Becomes Real, Tanya Luhrmann was struck by the sight of a man in front of a church, shedding tears over his inadequate faith that God would give him a new job. This struggle goes back to the time of Jesus, who was approached by a father with his possessed son, and upon asking for help, the father said, "I believe, but help me overcome my unbelief." That's from Mark chapter 9. Tanya observed this struggle of, quote, believers as the unbelieving when doing her field-based ethnographies with charismatic evangelical Protestants in Chicago and the San Francisco South Bay. These were people who acted and voted with their beliefs in ways to generate tangible consequences. But that didn't stop them from treating the invisible divine differently from how they treat mundane physical objects. They wouldn't ask God to do their daily chores for them, but still wholeheartedly insisted that everything is possible with God. People were apt to accept God's message to them, but were skeptical of God's messages to others. They strongly held to the belief that God's love is unfailing and unending, but also felt unloved and chastised when forgetting to pray or facing unanswered prayers. Daily prayer, weekly church attendance, praise, and worship must be kept within a person's life to keep God within the center of awareness. However, it was a no-brainer for the worshipers to realize that no kitchen table or any other mundane physical object would disappear if you didn't pay attention to it. She remarks on the mistaken assumption that can tend to be fundamental among anthropologists. That is to assume people who believe never doubt, because how could they doubt if they're constantly praising the Lord, unflinchingly stating their beliefs, and treating the supernatural as if it's like the ground beneath their feet? But apparently non-Western societies who have never been secularized are insusceptible to doubt, unlike our Western societies who have been entrenched in the scientific revolution and age of reason occurring in the late 17th to early 19th centuries. Belief that requires conscious effort to sustain it is mostly a phenomenon of Western Christian people. And when anthropologists reference belief in religious people, it is their way of dismissing it. Apart from what these anthropologists say, I think it is commonplace for skeptics to nowadays say that the believers, as unbelieving, who are like the doubting Thomas, wanting to see the nail-pierced hands on Jesus, are either delusional or lying to themselves about reality. Maybe that's irrelevant to the main point, but I simply mention it as another simple-minded approach to the cognition and psychology of religion. I, as a former atheist, now turned Christian, take great interest in Luhrmann, who wrote this book for the sake of neutrality and to, quote, speak for, and not to, quote, speak for nor against the genuine reality of gods and spirits, end quote. We both acknowledge that religious believers, depending on where they live, differ in how they distinguish the natural from the supernatural. However, we all still have the ability to distinguish the reality of tangible, visible stuff from the divine. We all have flexible ontologies, as she puts it. I think of how extremely anthropomorphic we are, but we each differ in our levels of anthropomorphism, that is, the act of assigning human traits to non-human things, such as animals, objects, and natural phenomena. Some classical examples are seeing a face in the clouds, seeing eyes on a car, or intentions behind moving geometric shapes on a computer screen. I'll even use myself as an example. Earlier today, I bumped into my bathroom door and became so angry that I slammed it as if I could teach it a lesson not to get in my way ever again. But the fact that people can sustain absent people in their minds and then also have sustaining relationships with absent and imagined conscious agents goes much further than the commonplace examples I mentioned before. This has led anthropologists who are skeptical of religion to assume this anthropomorphism as a large foundation for people's ongoing deliberative commitment to God's omnipresence that they want to convert into an intuition. Religious narratives and experiences seem to become even more personal once we consider Luhrmann's words on pages 9 through 10, saying, "Religious beliefs become part of the identity of those who assert them, and humans evaluate challenges to identity-defining beliefs differently from challenges to mundane beliefs. Mundane beliefs adjust to the empirical details. If I believe that my dog is in the study but I find her in the kitchen, I adjust my beliefs. If I am Jewish and believe that to be a faithful Jew, I should keep kosher, a belief that is important then to who I am. It will take much more effort for someone else to show me that I am wrong. People evaluate religious beliefs more in accordance with their sense of who they are and how they think the world should be." End quote. Now that I am finished with the personal aspects of Luhrmann's anthropological studies of religion and discussed Kastrup's empirical evidence for analytic idealism, I want to quickly visit his claim that universal consciousness impinges across the dissociative boundary. Consciousness is what Kastrup calls the sole ontological primitive. It is how the patterns and activities of universal consciousness appear to us as the physical world. Every tree, every rock, every human thought and feeling, including the thoughts and feelings about the God of the Bible and the deities of other religions, are all extensions of the influence from this universal consciousness. Like someone with dissociative identity disorder, again, maybe an uncomfortable way of putting it, we are the alternate personalities within the universal consciousness, with each of us standing up against amnesic barriers that give us the illusion of being isolated minds within this universal consciousness. This is why each of us can have individual subjective experiences, but we are influenced by the universal consciousness when thoughts from beyond the dissociative boundary leak into our awareness to prompt a perception of the physical world and sensory experience. The leak can even happen when we're not intentionally thinking about it. Take, for instance, a stressful memory that influences your mood, but you don't identify it as such and cannot pinpoint its origin or cause. Take another instance. The reason why we all can agree on the existence and heat of the sun is because of how universal consciousness similarly impinges upon all human alters. Since our boundaries are permeable and not absolute, we can have a shared reality of subtle interactions. A good example is the psychedelic drug called psilocybin that can increase the permeability of our boundaries and allow us to temporarily experience unity with universal consciousness. Now, if all of that sounds spooky and new age, just hold on, because we have to take stock of the fact that Kastrup is influenced by Hindu sacred texts and Jungian psychology. As a Christian, I don't endorse the underlying vibe and ambiance of the language. I am only using it to reach my final point that our thoughts are not just random, our thoughts are not just personal, and our thoughts are not just in our heads. They can have a source outside of us that is not us. For instance, when I get the thought that I should pray to Jesus or read my Bible, God is the one sending me the message. In the context of analytic idealism, it doesn't seem far-fetched to me that God is a real and personal agent, inaudibly extending the thought from his omnipresent mind and impinging across the dissociative boundary. And I think many traditional Christians would agree that Satan can do something similar with temptations and attacks, although Christians typically don't believe that he is a mind reader. Thank you for watching this episode of The Common Caveat. Be blessed. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell, and like.